They also say that they think of themselves primarily as Afghans. This is not Iraq, where it's Sunni Shia Kurd. This is an Afghanistan where, yes, sectarian identity matters, tribal identity matters, but there is a concept of nationhood when you talk to people and when you look at surveys. That's important. How do they feel about their government? They know it's corrupt. One more reason to believe the polls: 82% of Afghans in the last poll I saw said that, yes, we have way too much corruption in this country. But about 65% of them also said, even if Karzai's part of that, even if there were major improprieties in the election, we still accept him ultimately as perhaps the preferred or best leader we could have right now. I don't want to push that point too far, but it's worth putting on the table. 65% of Afghans have generally favorable views about Karzai. It's interesting. It's worth mentioning to balance some of the other points Peter's made. Let me talk a little bit about the Afghan army, finish with one or two more points on Karzai, and I'm, like any good Brookings analyst, going to try to muddle my position towards the end and wind up, with a little bit of an on the one hand, on the other. It's bad enough that I'm at Brookings. I was also at the Congressional Budget Office before that, so I'm not going to stick my neck out. We're all on the one hand, on the other people out of that organization. But let me say a few things about the Afghan army. The Afghan police are still a mess. And again, with huge admiration for the Afghans who have worked to try to build that police over the years, it's only in the last few months that the resources have begun to be appropriate. So I'm not here to defend the Afghan police for how they operate at the moment in general. But the Afghan army is showing a number of promising signs. Let me give you just a couple of snapshots of what we're seeing. First of all, we're seeing in various sectors of the South and the East, the Afghan army actually being willing to go out and plan and conduct operations on its own. And I went, for example, to the 3rd Brigade of the 203rd Corps last month, which is in Khost, one of the most dangerous areas. Over the ridgeline is the famous Miram Shah in North Waziristan, where we think that not only the Haqqani network, but maybe Osama bin Laden may even be located. And this is only 20 miles away. But the Afghans in Khost are actually planning and conducting operations to some extent on their own. And they inform the American forces nearby afterwards quite often. Now, this is an anecdote. It tells you only a little, but I heard a number of these anecdotes on my trip just a few weeks ago from people who said they had no such anecdotes a year or two ago. Another point, even though some of these Afghan units are willing to do things on their own, increasingly they are now partnered with NATO forces. And they do everything with NATO forces day in and day out. I'm going to use this as my brief little tribute to Stanley McChrystal, who obviously made some big mistakes in recent days, recent weeks, but I think was an amazing field commander, and I think one of his most important legacies will be the concept of partnering. What this means, for those of you who have not followed it, I know in this crowd it's a very sophisticated crowd. Many of you do understand the concept. But the basic idea is that once people come out of basic training, once they come out of unit training, and they're sent out to the field as an Afghan army formation, now 85% are partnered with a NATO unit of either comparable size or maybe one echelon difference in size. And what that means is they live close by, they do all their planning together, they do a lot of patrolling together. If they know they're going to be in a firefight, they try to go out together. And if the Afghans get ambushed, the NATO forces are on call to come help. That does tend to help build an institution when there's some chance of surviving an ambush. And until a year or two ago, the Afghan army and police did not have much of a chance to survive an ambush because we didn't have enough people there to help them, and we didn't partner with them. We didn't work hand in glove with them out in the field. Now we do. So you may say that's a theoretical concept. It's late in the day to be trotting out new ideas and new approaches. Fair enough. We should have done this long ago. But the concept is extraordinarily promising. So I don't just think about whether President Hamid Karzai is an adequate strategic partner. I think about whether the Afghan army is an adequate strategic partner, and I'm seeing a lot of encouraging signs. One quick caveat, a charge you often hear about the Afghan army, and there's an element of truth to it, is that it's largely Tajik. The General Officer Corps is close to 50% Tajik, but the overall army, more broadly defined, as people are now recruiting, is always within a few percent in terms of the new recruits of the demographic breakdown of the country. And that's a requirement for how we're doing business these days. The NATO command for training is much improved, much better ratio of trainers to recruits. They're putting people through basic training, literacy training, unit training, and then the partnering in the field. So think about that as well. I don't want to go, as I finish up, I'm going to just say one more word. I don't want to go too far down the path of defending Hamid Karzai. I think that would be probably unwise of me on multiple fronts, including the fact that Peter knows him much better than I do. But I will just leave you with this image of Karzai. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Mobutu's Zaire. Karzai is not Mobutu. Karzai, I think, wants to view himself as some kind of a latter-day Gandhi for his country. Now, that's not meant to be high praise, because I think with that concept in mind, he becomes way too weak in much of the decision-making about how to clamp down on corruption. So you're not going to hear a disagreement from me on that point. But this is also a person who is trying to be inclusive. We asked him to be inclusive in 2001 because we didn't want to deploy enough forces to actually require the warlords to be reined in and obey Kabul. Now we're complaining that he's trying to be too inclusive by holding on to some bums who we should really let go of, or maybe talking to Pakistan too much about a reconciliation strategy with part of the Haqqani network. You know, Karzai remains Karzai. He is a relatively weak, but in his own mind at least, I believe, Gandhi-esque father figure for his country. Now, he's not being a successful Gandhi, but I think it's important to understand that that's a concept you hear a lot of people discuss when they try to understand his psychology. That's a concept he will use. It does help explain the mistakes he's made in the past, and what it suggests to me is that he's capable of learning. Because if he wants to be Gandhi, he's not succeeding, and we've got to continue to figure out how to convince him that he's not succeeding. I think there are certain approaches that work better than others. I don't defend what Karzai said in early April, but I think the way General Jones handled the press briefing when President Obama went to Kabul was exactly wrong, with due respect to General Jones. It was predictable that this kind of a lashing out at Karzai would engender the kind of reaction we saw. That's not the way you handle him. I'm not saying there is any guaranteed successful way to handle him, but I know that's not the right way. And I think we have to think about how we work with this guy, with the fledgling, improving Afghan army, with the Afghan people that so much want success, and with an international coalition that remains impressively strong. So for me, the glass is about 55% full.
Okay.
Thanks.
I think the coffee's started to come around, so in a moment I'll bring in the audience. As a starting point, I would say we were slightly worried that they wouldn't have a sort of optimistic perspective, but Gandhi and Karzai, the comparison seems to work very well to get the ball rolling. I think you owe a question to Peter, because he asked you one. So, but hold your horses for one moment, and let me put a question to you yourself, Peter. Forgetting about how we got to this point, which in your view is clearly a mess, my question to you is not what's wrong at the moment with the counterinsurgency strategy, not what went wrong for the last 3, 4, 5, 6 years. What do we do now? What's your suggestion? If you were in the White House tomorrow, how would you change the situation?
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry if, having lived in India, the Gandhi analogy is an interesting one for me. I have to say, Mahatma Gandhi did not actually steal very many elections. In any event, look, the issue here is very simple. We don't need to debate whether Afghanistan is important or not. If the strategy we're pursuing cannot work, then it is not worth doing. And so we all agree that in a counterinsurgency we need to have a credible local partner.